All right. I am recording. My camera is on. I am unmuted. I think things are going in the right direction. Welcome, 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 welcome. I'm glad you're here. I see folks coming in. I'm gonna try to make this screen smaller, and I don't know that Zoom's gonna let me do that. Take a minute and make sure the chat is working. And if you would be so kind to say hello, put where you're coming in from, where you're calling in from. And I just really want to make sure that chat is working. So I am glad you're here today. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Today we are going to talk about how to really the most effective strategy I have found, or the strategies really that I have found to help people, help women drop their cravings and really get a handle on their cravings. Before we jump in, make sure if I just want to be sure that you can hear me. So if for some reason you can't hear me, put it in the question and answer, or put it in the chat. Carol, apparently you can't hear me because you just put that you're calling in from Texas. So I'm glad to have you from Texas. I hope it's warmer for you guys. It's actually been warmish, like it gives me hopes of spring up here in Kansas. So, all right. So we're going to talk today about kind of the way to again, the most effective strategies that I have seen for improving cravings and helping cravings. And I think most women find that this is the one thing that really blocks them from getting to the health that they're looking for, is they crave these foods so much and they can't figure out a way to stop craving for them. Yes, in previous craving webinars, and I still hold, and we'll talk about this a little bit, I still hold true that cravings are created in our brain. The reason that I crave brownies, and once I find out that they have nuts in them, I'm like, game over. It's not interesting to me anymore. The reason that is because of my thoughts, and that is an element of it. But the more I look in and I research and I find information and I see the science and I hear the literature on these processed foods, the more I realize these foods that are making us sick are really designed to make us crave them. And starting with that is going to always be the most effective way for us to get a handle, get a leg up on not craving these foods. Um, our thoughts about them are an issue because, right, whether I'm eating brownies with walnuts in them or brownies without walnuts in them, the dopamine effect in my brain is the same. So, yes, that thought is still an issue that needs to be addressed, but it's a lot easier to address those cravings and those desires and that compulsion for those foods when I'm not constantly putting in my mouth and continuing to drive the neurochemistry that happens in our brains. That's what we're going to talk about today. I do want everybody to take a moment and pat yourselves on the back for being here because, again, I always think that it's important for us to look at the things that we're doing for ourselves each day. I talk a lot about the journaling practice that I have. I have a journaling practice most mornings. When I journal, I'll journal about 5 things. I journal about what I'm going to eat, what I'm going to do for movement. I journal gratitude. I make myself narrow to the 3 things that I really want to focus on for being grateful for. I look at my goals. And then the other thing that I always do in my journaling practice is, what am I doing for me today? I spent years of my life having food be the only thing that I was doing for me, that I recognized as doing for me in a day. And when that food went away, like, I had to start, like, what the hell else is there, right? Like, I'm not having those foods. I'm not eating the chocolate. I'm not having, the soda. I'm not having the wine. I'm not doing those things. Since I'm not doing those things, what the hell is left for me? What am I doing? And so I think that focusing on what you're doing for you and naming it and calling it and acknowledging it and being loud and proud, for me, sometimes it's as simple as, my daughter and I, we go to the coffee shop before she goes to school, and it's just her and me. And we sit and I drink a cup of coffee and she sits and plays on her phone. It's not like she's even engaging me. But for me, it's being in her presence. That's something I do for me every day. Today, this webinar, maybe that one thing that you're doing for you something that you're doing for yourself that focuses on you and that gets you some health. And I think that naming those things for what they are is really important. So I'm glad you're here and I'm glad this is what you're doing today. I am going to share my slides and we are going to get started. Maybe I'm going to share my slides. I've minimized the Zoom, and so it may not, I need to get to that. I need to get to that screen. Here we go. All right, guys, here comes the slides. So, okay, yeah. So cleaning up your diet is going to lead to, it's going to be one of the most important or imperative ways. Like, I don't know, it's just one of the most powerful ways that you can really help yourself to really reduce your cravings and to manage your cravings. Of course, cleaning up your diet is going to focus on real foods. It's going to be avoiding processed foods, and it's definitely going to lower your blood sugars. So that is what we are going to talk about today. These processed foods cause your cravings when we start to, one, see that the processed foods cause our cravings, but number two, when we start to pull those out of our life, then our cravings just get so much more manageable, so much easier. Processed foods lead to cravings. They're designed that way. We're going to talk today about that. We're going to talk about what a processed food is. We're going to talk about how the different ways that they contribute to your cravings. And then we're going to talk about the additives that processed foods put into them, into those foods that cause you to have these cravings. And one, you're going to get information here that's going to tell you how you discern what's processed and what's not. Two, you're going to get information at the end of this webinar about what else can we be doing? How can we make this process? There will be a withdrawal effect when we pull these processed foods out of our lives, and figuring out how to manage that withdrawal time frame, that withdrawal period, is going to be imperative and helpful. I do want to talk a review quickly about type 2 diabetes and what causes it. Type 2 diabetes is not that you don't have enough insulin, and I think everybody here has heard me talk about this. It's not that there's not enough insulin. It's that you have so much insulin that your body no longer responds to it. Your body becomes, your cells become insulin resistant. And processed foods are a huge contributor to insulin resistance. And we're going to talk about why that is. So what is a processed food? I like to think of these as food-like substances. These are not true human food, and they're not nutrition. Nutrients are those things that our body requires. Nutrients are required by our body to function normally, to have energy, to do the things that our body needs to do. There is nothing about a processed food that is required. There's nothing. In one of the coaching calls that was recorded in the fall of last year, and then in the end of the year, they went out as podcast episodes. It was one of the really light bulb moments for a woman on one of those calls, because she was talking about when she gave up drinking alcohol. And it wasn't that she ever had a horrible alcohol problem. She had just cut alcohol from her life. And then she was talking about giving up cigarettes. And her response to me, as she was working through the thoughts in her brain, because it's like, what's the difference between the food and the alcohol, or the food and the cigarettes? And her response was, well, we have to eat. And my response was, we do not have to eat food that makes us sick. That food is absolutely not required for us as human beings, and it makes us sick. And these are processed foods. Yes, sometimes it is junk food, but sometimes it's disguised, it's masked as healthy food. So processed food is when we take a natural food, a real food, and we alter it into something else. Usually that alteration leads to concentration of carbohydrates. So this first example I'm going to give, protein bars. And again, this is something that could be portrayed as a health food. In fact, many protein bars have some healthy claim on their labeling. Okay. So protein bars, protein, real food in a real situation, non-processed foods, protein is going to be eggs. It's going to be meat. It's going to be nuts, maybe, right? When we alter it, right? Remember, altering this processing of food causes a concentration of the carbohydrates. That concentration of the carbohydrate causes us to make too much insulin. When we have too much insulin in our system, our cells become insulin resistant and we get diabetes. Okay. This is how processed foods lead to us being sick with type 2 diabetes. But we're going to talk today how it also leads to a huge surge of dopamine in your brain, which makes you want it all the time. Okay. Dopamine, you're going to hear this over and over today. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter of motivation. Yes, there's a feel-goodness that comes with dopamine. But more than that, dopamine motivates you to repeat a behavior. When we have foods like a protein bar or other processed foods that cause a huge surge of dopamine in our brain, then that leads us to be motivated, heavily motivated to repeat the eating of that food. So that is, oh my gosh, I've lost my mouse. I've lost my cursor. So that is, one of the reasons, the twofold, that processed foods are really a problem. One, they cause a concentration of carbohydrate, which causes a huge insulin release, and that keeps us insulin resistant. But in addition, they make us crave it all the time. All right, so next example is going to be strawberries and strawberry spread, right? Fruit spreads, jellies, jams, those sorts of things. The real food is the strawberry. The fruit spread is the processed food, and that's a food-like substance. It's not a real food. When we cook any natural food, when we heat it, the heat breaks the bond between the fiber that's in the natural food and the carbohydrate that's in the natural food. The heat dissolves or like breaks down the fiber. So that's why cooked fruits and vegetables are frequently softer than like raw fruits and vegetables, because when we cook them, we break down the fiber component and it dissolves and goes away, and it no longer has that structure that makes it hard anymore. When we do that, now we don't have the fiber, and all we're doing is leaving the carbohydrate component of that food. And that carbohydrate is going to lead to glucose in our bloodstream, like blood sugar. That's what it'll be absorbed as, a high insulin release and insulin resistance. Okay. And of course, we don't just want the sweetness that comes with cooked strawberries, although they are sweeter. Even if you think about cooked carrots, right? Cooked carrots are significantly sweeter than raw carrots. And when we think about why that is, it's because it's concentrating. The cooking is concentrating the carbohydrate component. That is a form of processing. Nobody got diabetic over their cooked carrot problem. I don't want anybody freaking out like they can't cook their veggies. You can, but recognize it concentrates the carbohydrate component. Okay. So these fruit spreads or these jellies and jams are a food-like substance. They are concentrated, they are processed, and they definitely worsen our insulin resistance and also make you crave them more. Orange juice and any juice, right? Oranges are the natural, real food. The juice is the food-like substance, and they will lead to increased dopamine and increased insulin. Same thing is true with wheat. Wheat that you see here on the left side of the slide, the real food, the wheat, that's what real food is. That's what real wheat is. Flour is a processed component that removes all the fiber, all the micronutrients, the vitamins, the vitamins and the minerals from that plant that we grew in the ground. And it removes all that stuff. And all it does is concentrate the carbohydrate component. And again, that leads to a high insulin release, which leads to type 2 diabetes, but it also leads to a huge dopamine release. So let's talk about what that looks like. This is the neurochemistry of processed foods, of altering these foods, of concentrating the carbohydrate component. Remember, 10,000 years ago, the human being lived in a very unsafe environment, right? Like procuring food, hunting and gathering, getting food, making dinner was a lot more risky than getting in your car with your side and your front airbags and your seatbelt and putting the seatbelt on and driving down the road where there are rules of the road and stop signs and stoplights. And you go into the store and you, along with all the other humans, are looking to hunt and gather through the store to get your food. And you purchase your food, and the FDA has made sure that it's not got any bugs or bacteria that will kill you in it, that it's not the poisonous form of a mushroom, it's the safe form of a mushroom. And nobody in the grocery store typically is trying to kill you while you're hunting and gathering. There are not bugs in there that are going to bite you and poison you. There's none of these things that are happening. Hunting and gathering, quote unquote, which is what we call it in my house because I'm snarky, but hunting and gathering, procuring food in modern day is a safe endeavor. It's just a safe experience. 10,000 years ago, it was not. You could injure yourself while hunting and gathering. You could get bit by a snake, a scorpion, or some other deadly creature. The thing that you are hunting might turn and try to hunt you. You could gather a poisonous berry or a poisonous mushroom that could kill you. Like it was dangerous to go out and get food. And the human being is driven to be safe, like on a foundational, like very archaic level. The human being seeks safety and security. Okay. So without a little motivation to get us out of the cave, which was safe, we would have stayed in there and starved to death. Our brain had to develop this way. The human being had to develop this way to motivate us to get out of the cave and go and hunt and gather food. And that motivation is dopamine. Okay. Dopamine is released when we eat food, all the food. Dopamine is released more when we eat foods with carbohydrates in them because they were energy dense. And again, that was rare. We had to have a neurochemical experience when we ate these things, right? We had this have this brain experience when we ate these things so that not only we were driven to go out and seek them again, but we would also remember those berries grow behind that rock by that tree in that area. Like I need to look for these berries because they're high in energy, micronutrients, fibers, those sorts of things, and they keep me alive. So dopamine is what is going to cause your craving. It drives your cravings. Carbohydrates cause the dopamine. Concentrating carbohydrates causes more dopamine, which is what causes this heavy motivation to these foods that produce tons of this dopamine. So there's what I call the dopamine cycle. I actually got this from another coach. It's a dopamine cycle. When we eat natural foods, there's a natural dopamine production in our brain. I like this little Zen brain here. This brain is all Zen and very at peace. This is just the way the world works. We're very accepting, right? We have a natural dopamine production. We enjoy the foods, and our brain emphasizes the importance of these foods for us to stay alive, and we seek more of the food. And that gives us just this natural dopamine release. We get this natural, gentle cycle of dopamine emphasizing the food. We seek the food, we eat the food. There's dopamine. There's just this nice, gentle cycle. When we take a natural food and we concentrate that natural food, we get a concentrated amount of carbohydrates, and that gives us a concentrated over release of dopamine into our brain. That makes our brain overemphasize these foods. That overemphasis, that over focus, that hyper focus on it, this is food desire, right? These are the cravings that we're all talking about. This is food fixation. When we're fixated on it, we overconsume it. And that gives us even a higher release of dopamine. And suddenly we're overemphasizing it more, right? We're going to talk about how this leads to habits and how this leads to addiction, okay? And how those things are different. But recognize this overproduction of dopamine over motivates us to eat that food again, which then over motivates us or over produces dopamine more and over motivates us even more. It gets into, instead of this gentle cycle, it gets into this chaotic, excitatory fixation. You saw where that one brain was zenny and normal, and this one has all the chaotic connections going around in the brain, and it's all hyper fixated on this light here. That light is the food. We hyper fixate on this food because of the way dopamine affects our brain. So reward-based learning or habit loop formation. So this is how our brain tries to put things on autopilot. Okay. Habits, like if you think about the first time you ever brushed your teeth, like that took like if you have ever watched a kid do it, right? Like there's this awkward, it takes a lot of focus. They have to learn how to do it. Same thing with driving. Like I've taught my 15-year-olds how to drive, and it's been slow and painful for me. And, it's just awkward. They don't do things right. There's jerky motions. It's just awkward. Then if you do it for a while, right, you get this neuromuscular behavior that happens, and you just get these things on autopilot. It's a habit. You know how to do it. Same with brushing your teeth. Like you just brush your teeth smooth. You know what to do. Your fingers know what to do with the toothpaste and with the toothbrush. But if you watch a 5-year-old do it, it's very awkward. Or maybe a 3-year-old do it. It's very awkward. Okay. So when we have habits that are forming, our brain wants to autopilot things as much as possible, put them on a habit. Because if it becomes a habit, we don't have to expend so much mental energy doing it. And our bodies look to conserve energy. So habits are formed either by punishment or reward, right? When we're rewarded, so we have a trigger, we have a behavior, that behavior is rewarded, usually with dopamine in our brain, we start to move towards the stimuli that produces that dopamine that's previously been associated with a dopamine production, okay? So sometimes with eating, it's like there's a curiosity. I wonder what those berries taste like, and you eat them. So you have the trigger of curiosity, you have the behavior of eating it, you get the reward of dopamine. You are going to start moving towards those foods. Now, we've all had the experience. I don't like hot tamales, right? Or the brownies, right? The brownies with walnuts. I don't like them. I still get a dopamine release in my brain, but they aren't all hooky just because they're dopamine. There's an experience that you have that you label, like that you give a value of positive to. And that is individualistic. That is, I don't know that it's, specific and different for every human being, but there are definitely people who are grouped, right? Like some people like hot tamales, and I'm not that kid, right? I don't like the candy at all. I don't like Starbursts are never compelling. Hot tamales are never compelling to me. They're just not on. And black licorice is another one. My mother loved black licorice. I don't mind it, but lots of people are absolutely no thank you to black licorice, right? If you've got something that you're like, I love this thing and other people hate it, put it in the chat, right? Like it's not, there are other people. I mean, clearly there's black licorice company, so there's enough people out there that they love black licorice. But for the most part, you have one thing we have something that you like. Chocolate baked goods are my thing, right? Sometimes it's candies for others. Sometimes it's savory things and chips. So when we have that and we get that dopamine response, we are going to move towards reproducing. Because remember, dopamine's a hormone that wants to motivate you to repeat it. Okay. The dopamine is the reward, and it solidifies the habit formation. At some point, we realized in life that we were rewarded by eating certain foods. We got a bit of dopamine in our brain. As time progressed, we started to use this as a way to reward us for all the things in life. And we also started to use it as a way to avoid discomfort and pain and punishment in our life. Okay. So that is where we get into what's called this addiction type reward-based learning. When you can see the trigger is the cure or the curiosity, and you have the behavior. You can see that over here, and you see that you have your behavior and your reward. Then suddenly, like, because it was curious and you got a reward from it, suddenly you get excited when you see the trigger again. So if it's cake, right? Suddenly, like the first time you ate the cake, you didn't know you were going to get rewarded with dopamine, but you did it and you're like, whoo, that was amazing. And then you see cake and you're like, actually, I remember this stuff. This is amazing, right? Like this is what happened 10,000 years ago. I didn't know what berries were, but I ate them. And then I got this dopamine release. And now when I see berries, I'm like, oh yeah, this stuff is amazing. I remember this. We get this excitement associated with it. You eat the food, you get another dopamine reward. And then you start to see the food, you eat the food, and then you start to seek the food in order to get the reward. But then it shifts. And this is where it gets sticky. When we suddenly start to, the trigger becomes seeking the reward. It's no longer like I enjoy the food. It's that suddenly I seek the dopamine that comes at the end of the food. You eat the food and you get dopamine. When we switch to the trigger being also the reward or the trigger is seeking the reward. It's not the food anymore. This is what leads to the sticky, craving, addictive type behavior. Okay. And so this is Judson Brewer's work. If anybody hasn't had a chance to read, Brewer has a great book. It's called The Craving Mind. He explains this, I think, quite a bit better than I do. But this is his life work. He actually is an MD, PhD, and he works with addiction. Both alcohol and cigarette smokers are the primary place that he works. But he definitely applies this to everything from food to social media. So this is his work, this habit loop. I meant to say that. I don't want everybody to think my brain came up with it. Somebody else who's really bright came up with it. But this is where we lead to these craving addictive behaviors. This is where we lead to, I am doing something even though it causes damage. I am doing something at the expense of my health, whether it be alcohol, cigarettes, or if you're a type 2 diabetic, food. Okay. This becomes because we're looking to feel better, that becomes the trigger. And we're using the food as a tool to get the dopamine release. Okay. So let's talk about processed foods and why they lead to this. We talked about the concentration of carbohydrates and that will lead to an elevated dopamine release, and that's true and real. Recognize these foods actually use at least the carbohydrate binds to the same receptor in our brain that drugs like heroin and morphine and dilaudid and fentanyl is the one that we're seeing quite a problem with these days. These are called opioids or narcotics, and they bind to a receptor in our brain called the mu receptor. These carbohydrates bind to that same receptor. And the reason that it's important to realize that, although nobody usually steals from their grandmother to get M&Ms or cake, we see this with narcotic use, though. People will take big risks and behave in a way that doesn't align with their integrity and their values in order to get these narcotics. I do think some of that does happen. People do take big risks with eating, right? If your A1C was 11.2 and you're considering a cookie or a chocolate cake, that is a big risk that you're willing to take because you're wanting that receptor to be triggered, right? If again, nobody's stealing from grandma, right? But also people won't stand up for themselves in a dinner situation when they're like, oh, this is pasta. I can't eat pasta. I have diabetes. It's going to cause my sugars to go haywire, right? So these are the things. Nobody's stealing for it. Nobody's like killing for pasta, I hope. But the understanding that we do still act outside of our value system because of this addictive property. Okay. The other thing to realize is when you stop eating these foods, just like with those drugs, there is a withdrawal phase that you will go through. And we'll talk about that here in just the next slide. So, and we're about done with the slides. I know last week we had our last webinar, there was the food label webinar. There's a lot of information in that. That was the feedback that I got on that food label webinar. This food additive slide is very similar to some of the stuff we saw there. If you have any questions about it, even about the food label webinar, we can address those today, but don't hesitate to ask any questions, even if you're watching on the YouTube replay. The feedback I got from that was it was a lot of information. So if any of it seemed confusing or if any of it wasn't clear or if like the first part was clear and then you were lost in the last part, don't hesitate to re-listen to it. It's on the YouTube channel and then ask any questions that you might have. So the food additives that can be an issue or that are added specifically to work in that neurochemistry on the brain in order to make you want more of it. Sugars clearly, I mean, that's carbohydrates that we're adding, right? Sugars clearly are added in a way to make you crave it. This is why sugars are in everything. Sugars are in ketchup. Ketchup is a savory food. It doesn't need sugar. That's why that's why sugar is in pasta sauce. Again, a savory food doesn't need sugar. Ketchup. I'm not sure why I'm stuck on ketchup. Sugar is in the coating on Planters peanuts. The roasted salted Planters peanuts, if you look at the label, there's sugar in them. Sugar is in all of these foods, okay? So sugar is added by food processors, by food manufacturers, so that you will want more of it. Period. End of sentence. That's the only thing it's doing there, okay? Artificial sweeteners are added for the same reason. You look at the ketchup bottle and the ketchup will be like, it's no sugar ketchup. Yeah, no, it has sucralose in it. So they've got an artificial sweetener in it. You actually have to look at the label and make sure they haven't added any sweetener. And there is ketchup you can get. Don't worry, it's $7.50 for a small bottle or something ridiculous, but it is what it is. I think that that just is crazy, but that's what people who want to be healthy will pay for it. So, those foods, sugars and artificial sweeteners are added to foods that shouldn't be sweet because food manufacturers want you to eat it and want you to want it. Oils, corn oil, vegetable oil, canola oil, again, added to foods to make your taste like your mouth like the way it feels. It's added to foods to make you get that bliss point, the combination of salt, sugar, and fat. The fat is the oil that food manufacturers add those in ratios in order to get what's called a bliss point, where it feels in your mouth, the melting in your mouth, the feel in your mouth, and they call it mouth feel, is exactly where you want it to get the most bang for their buck, the bliss point. And there's a perfect ratio for a lot of foods to get to that point. So those corn oils, the vegetable canola, those oils are added to get there. Most of the time, they will put like vegetable oil, or they'll put all of these oils. Many of the times, I shouldn't say most of the time, but a lot of the times they will put all of these different oils on one label because there is not really one that they're looking for that is part of their perfect recipe. They interchange what's cheapest for them to buy in the moment. And so if they just put all of them on the label, they don't have to change the packaging every time. So that's another thing to think about. And this is cheap stuff. These oils were actually developed, I believe, in World War II. It may have been World War I. I wasn't there, but this is what I read. They were developed for machinery back in one of the world wars. So recognizing that that is what we're using in our food when you're getting corn oil or vegetable oil or canola oil. MSG is another one. We know there's a lot of things associated with MSG, everything from headaches to kind of this nausea. People feel badly when they eat it. MSG is entirely added for no other reason than to make you want it. That's how it interacts with the brain, is to make you want more of it. MSG on a food label has been added by a food manufacturer, so you will eat more of their food. Coloring or artificial flavor or natural flavors. I meant to change that. I see that it says flavoring. I saw that the other day when I was looking these over. It should be flavoring. Artificial and natural flavorings. Again, for natural flavorings, they're taking like a food substance, a flavor that was somehow in a blueberry in nature, and they're concentrating it and putting it into your food to make you want more because the food doesn't actually have flavor in it. When the artificial flavors, they are just concocting a chemical in a lab and they are putting it in your food to give you a flavor because the food doesn't actually have flavor and they want you to keep eating it. Colorings, that's one of the things that's mind-blowing to me. If you're having to add coloring to the food so that it looks more appealing, that's a question everybody should, like, why am I eating this? That's clearly a processed food. Flour and gluten, same thing. The gluten content in flour in other countries is actually quite a bit lower than it is in the States. We have bred our wheat to have a higher gluten content. And the reason that we've done that is because your brain loves the gluten. It's one of those things that makes us want the food more. And so we have higher gluten in our flour here, which is also, of course, leading to things like gluten intolerances and celiac type of issues. And then emulsifiers. So these are going to be like your xanthan gums, your guar gums, polysorbates, and there's a couple different varieties of that. Lecithins, I think is how they pronounce that. Those are all emulsifiers is what they're called, and they are put in the food to give it a texture that you will like. And they've done studies to figure out what humans, or what does the human mouth like? What is it drawn to? And these are put in the foods because their consistency and their texture is not at that bliss point that they're looking to create. Okay. All of these things, these are very, very common things that food manufacturers put. In fact, I would highly recommend any packaged food that you go into your cupboard and pull out, unless you have actively sought to avoid these things, 80% of your foods probably have one, if not more, of these things in them, of your processed foods, of your packaged foods in your cupboards. These things are all added in order to make you crave them, want them, desire them, eat more of them. If you want to cut down on your cravings, cut these things out of your life, cut these things out of your diet. That is going to make it easier to not eat those foods. So let's talk about that. How do we make it easier? How do we stop eating these foods? How do we make it easier to stop this? You're gonna have to break the habit, right? Like this is what we do with anything else that we're doing in a way that's detrimental to our lives. If we're smoking cigarettes and it's causing, I mean, like all cigarettes are going to cause lung problems. If we're smoking cigarettes in a way that's causing lung problems and we know we need to stop, we just have to break that habit. Sometimes that involves doing things differently. Like when you go to the gas station to get gas, you always pay outside and you never go in to the processed food amusement park of a gas station, right? Like there's so much junk in those places. Like it's anything you want. All the processed food that you would ever want is inside a gas station. So as you're breaking the habit of eating these foods, maybe you don't go into the gas station. Maybe this is true about the grocery store. You don't go into the grocery store. Maybe you it's the Instacart, I think is what they call it, or whatever your grocery store has to just pick up the groceries. Now, are you going to get the best looking head of lettuce when you do that? No, hands down. That's the reason I don't use those things. But if you're going to get a mediocre head of lettuce and not get a bunch of chips and candy, like in the end, does that not work for you? Is that not more ideal as you're breaking this habit? Okay. Whatever you need to do to change your behavior to break that habit is going to be helpful. Sometimes it's the not going in the grocery store, not going in the gas station, but sometimes it's putting a post-it note on the cabinet so that your brain is reminded to not have the chips, to not have the thing. There's something in there, a step before that your brain has to process that breaks just that behavior that has become monotonous and rote and habitual. Okay. Whatever it might be, figuring out how to do that, changing the way that you walk through the office to avoid the break room while you're, at work because there's donuts in there. Maybe that means putting a note on your door jamb as you leave the office to remind you to change the way you walk through the office so you can avoid the break room. Whatever that looks like, finding some ways to break your habits is beneficial in the beginning. Okay. You cannot rely on this for the rest of your life. You have to eventually learn to reprogram the things that you think about these foods. So for me, like, I think it's beneficial. I definitely, I did not do this intentionally, but over time, and that's probably why it took me years to kind of get to a place in my relationship with food that I'm finally like, yeah, I can look at all the donuts under the sun. They are not appealing. I'm not going to eat them. That's not a risk for me. And it's because I really truly do believe that donuts are bad for my health. I had to connect this new behavior, walking a different way from the break room, having a post-it note on my cabinet, not eating lunch. That was something I did for a long time. I used my lunch break instead to go out for a walk. All of those things were a behavior break, right? A habit break. They were that. In addition, I had to, over time, reprogram the things that I believed about those foods. If you can do those things together, you're going to get farther faster. Okay. Breaking this habit is going to stop the addiction. It's going to stop the dopamine surge to the brain. It's going to stop feeding that addictive neurochemistry to your brain. And that is going to be, over time, it decreases your brain's drive to eat that. Okay. But make sure these are things that you can do. This is 9 things here that you can do that can make it easier for you. Making a plan. Everybody knows I'm a big planner. I believe that planning is beneficial. A plan does not equal health. Not putting food in your mouth that makes you sick, that's what's going to create health, okay? So if you don't have a plan today, if you didn't make a plan, awesome. You don't have to have a plan. What you have to do is not put food that makes you sick into your mouth. That's all. Okay, I know that's easier said than done. A plan does make sure that you have something for lunch that's not going to make you sick because you made a plan for it. A plan does make sure that gosh, is that candy there okay? Is that fruit there okay? Is this bread really a problem? If it's not on the plan, okay? A plan is a decision ahead of time that you lean on so you don't have to continue to make the decision over and over and over and over and over again. You get decision fatigue, you break, eat the pizza. That's what a plan does. That's how a plan makes it easier. That's how a plan helps you stop eating those things. Drink your water. That's another huge thing, right? Our brains, I think everybody's very familiar with the idea that brains frequently confuse thirst for hunger. Make sure you're drinking all your water. It also fills your belly up with something. If your belly feels empty, put a bunch of water in it. It also helps your body, your biochemistry work more effectively. All the way around. It makes your skin look fabulous. It's just good for you. Drink your water. I there's, mixed evidence about how much you can get or how much you should drink. I would just make sure you're getting like 64 ounces into your body before 3 p.m. during the day. Then you're not up all night peeing and you're feeling good and your body's functioning on all cylinders. Drink your water. Have healthy fat in your life. That's another big one. Fat makes you feel satiated. It makes you feel satisfied. Olive oil, avocados, nuts to a degree, although watch your nuts because most of the nuts that we buy in the store that are roasted, they are fried, they are baked, they are cooked, they are associated. If you look on the label, they're going to have vegetable oil, corn oil, they're going to have some kind of, canola oil in them. So those industrial oils. So raw is going to probably be preferential, but roasted nuts that have been roasted in corn oil, I think are vastly better than a donut. Okay, they're going to fix your diabetes. But I would not call that a healthy fat, is my point. Raw nuts with their just natural cashew oil or almond oil or whatever, that's going to be ideal if you're using nuts to get healthy fat into your life, into your diet. Outside of that, avocados are great. Outside of that, olive oil has the best evidence behind it. Period. End of sentence. Are, oh gosh, olive oil. Oh, I'm trying to think of the other oils that they'll use and things. Almond oils, they use all sorts of nut and seed oils. I would not use grapeseed or rapeseed oil. I think those are all sketchy. I would definitely lean lightly, like have only those seed oils, only in very small amounts. Sunflower seed oil is another one that they like to roast nuts in. I would not lean heavily on those. I would lean heavily on fats in their natural form. So that's going to be fatty vegetables like an avocado or olive oil if you're going to add it to anything, because olive oil has just the most evidence. But the more fat that you have in your diet, the more you feel full, the more you feel satiated. Quality protein is another thing you're going to want to make sure that you have in your life. There are studies out there where the protein actually binds certain neurons in your brain or in your gut that goes to your brain and tells your brain that you're totally full. It makes you feel fuller. So quality proteins with all the amino acids and essential amino acids is going to be really important. Fiber clearly is going to be important. Not only does it feed your gut microbiome, and that gut microbiome sends all sorts of messages all over your body, telling yourself that you're full, telling yourself that, energy, all sorts of things happen from this microbiome and it's fed by this fiber. But the fiber also takes a long time to digest and to move through your system. So you actually feel quantity. You feel more in your gut for longer. So more fiber in your diet is also going to be beneficial. Sleep, there are so many studies out there that tell you if you are not getting adequate sleep, you are going to make bad food decisions. Period. End of sentence. This is a no-brainer that has been well known for years. When you have slept 3 hours at night and you're getting up and having to do your day anyway, nobody's craving celery sticks at that point. We're all craving potato chips and ice cream bars and chocolate and bread and all of the junk. So give yourself a break, man. Make sure you're getting enough sleep when you can. Okay. Like there are things that happen in life and we can't get enough sleep. It should never be Jimmy Kimmel on the television or your favorite show on Netflix. It should not be getting one last project done. Like those things are going to literally, one, lack of sleep, we know without changing the diet, not enough sleep will lead to an insulin resistant state. That's well documented. But in addition, if you want to not crave junk food that makes you sick, get enough sleep. Give yourself a break there. Exercise. Some people will talk about craving more food when they exercise. I would just, if you're in that category, make sure you have a plan. Maybe you're exercising right before your mealtime. Maybe you have a high protein snack that's scheduled for right after exercise, whatever that looks like. But exercise gives you something to do instead of eating. Right? That's what, again, I used to do this for my lunch break all the time. I would just go out for a long walk. I'd put a podcast on history or whatever was interesting, and I'd go out for a long walk over the lunch break instead of going and eating. A withdrawal plan. I think that this is important. Having a plan for how you're going to manage withdrawal symptoms. You will have irritability, you will have some nausea probably, and you will have some headaches. Okay. And your brain in that moment is going to tell you M&Ms is the only thing that will fix those problems. And that's just not true. Okay. Irritability can be helped by deep breaths, deep breathing, relaxing, maybe meditation, maybe just some deep breathing. Maybe it's candle. Maybe it's great potpourri. Maybe it's some incense. Maybe it's a fun book. Maybe it's a fun podcast. Maybe it's a call to your family who you love. There's 100 different ways to handle irritability that doesn't involve chocolate or foods that make you sick. Okay. You may have a headache. And again, your brain's going to be like, the only thing, I think I've shared this a lot. I've shared this on the podcast. So you may have heard this story that there was a time when I was going through this withdrawal, and I had the most amazing headache after work. It was spectacular. And it was so uncomfortable. And I was hell bent. And it was at the end of the day. And I was coming and I was just at my wit's end. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to have some chocolate because nobody should live with headaches like this. This is miserable. I shouldn't have to do this. And what I ended up doing, I was like, okay, you can have the chocolate, but you need to meditate first. You need to go and do a 10-minute meditation and see how you feel after that. And the meditation that I came across, it was random and serendipitous and lucky. I came across a body scan. And a body scan meditation takes you through all the parts of your body and you scan them and see what's happening there. So as I did that body scan, you go from your head, you go to your throat, you go to your chest, you go to your back, you go to your arms, you go to your abdomen, you go to your pelvis, you go to your legs, you go to your lower legs, you go to your feet, you go to your toes, right? You do the scan, like what's in there, what's checking in. As I check in, what experience am I having there? And what I realized is, yes, my head hurt and the rest of my body felt amazing. My arms felt light. My skin felt cool. My belly felt empty. My chest felt light. I mean, all of these things. The suffering I was experiencing from my headache was happening only in my head, in my brain. It was not happening in the rest of my body. So that was a really good experience to have, right? Like, oh, this is just in my brain. I don't need to go and, eat a bunch of food to have this go away. Like it's just in my brain. And so what I realized then is instead of eating chocolate, which would have now made my belly feel horrible and probably my chest feel a little edgy and anxious, what I realized is why don't I just treat my headache with some Tylenol? That's what Tylenol actually does. That treats headaches. It turns out M&Ms don't treat headaches. Tylenol does. So get a plan for how you're going to manage that. If you get nauseous with it, how are you going to manage it? Are you going to have water? Are you going to have ice water? Are you going to have lemon in your ice water? Are you going to have fizzy water? How do you want to manage some nausea if that occurs? Are you going to have maybe ginger? Because ginger will definitely help with nausea, right? Like, how is that going to work? How are you going to manage that? Lastly, I encourage you to find hobbies, especially if you tend to be a muncher at night. Find hobbies that you enjoy and start doing them. I encourage you to start with that list of things that you've always said, gosh, if I had more time, I would blank. Start with that list and start doing them. Maybe if I had more time, I would travel to Greece. Maybe that's not on the table for you tonight as you're not eating food, but maybe you can find a podcast about traveling to Greece. Maybe you can find a book about it. Maybe you can find a movie. There's all sorts of things that you can do. Maybe you can just sit and surf the net and look at pictures of Greece, right? Like there are all sorts of things that you can do that's on that list of things that if I had more time, I would blank. I'd start knitting. I'd do more art. I'd be more creative. I'd read. I'd call my grandma. I'd do all these things. Start working through those things when you're craving those foods. It is not going to make the craving go away, but it's not going to be as suffering as sitting there going, God, I just want that food. Okay. So that is what I have. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening next month so you have an idea because I know that I'm doing better, but not great at getting information out ahead of time. So I'm trying to get more of it set ahead of time so I can get it out ahead of time. But if you have any questions, if you have any specific food questions, specific craving situations, anything like that, any questions about the science of all of this, please make sure you put it in the chat or put it in the question and answer box. Next month is all things intermittent fasting. That is what the podcast is going to be focused on, and that is what the webinars are going to be focused on. So on March 6th, there's going to be a webinar, and I'll talk about how to stop eating when your meal or your planned food is complete. This is a skill most women struggle with, especially in this fasting element, in this fasting practice. Most women are like, man, I made it to 20 hours and now I'm going to eat. Like we're ready to get on it. So we're going to talk about how to stop eating once the plan is completed. Okay. Lots of women find that they're still hungry and they want to keep munching. And so we're going to talk about strategies to how to do that, slowing things down and working on that. Because again, it's a really important skill to do when you're fasting. And then on March 20th, we're going to talk about restaurants and how do you manage restaurants when you're in a fasting window. I love that topic because I think it's fun. Maybe it's that inner like punk rock kid that's like, I don't want to follow the rules. Maybe that's why I love it. I don't know. But I love working that strategy. I honestly like even like walking into a restaurant with friends and I'll get a soda water and I don't order any food and they get food and I'll be like, okay, at the end I'll be like, I want to have this. I want this salad. Will you make it for me to go? And then I bring it home and that's either my meal later in the day or it's my meal the next day. So there's all sorts of strategies for managing restaurants when you're fasting. And so we'll talk about that on March 20th. So that is what will happen next month. I will be talking during the podcast about fasting basics, like what regimens to follow, how to get started, and also hacks to get through the fast. So I don't see any questions. I am actually surprised this went as long as it did because I thought that when I was running through it, things seemed to go pretty quickly. I'm going to stop sharing. I don't have YouTube up, so if there's any questions in there, I am not sure, but I'll answer them when I go through and look at them. So I hope this was helpful. Again, I'm glad you all took time for you today. If you have any questions about this specifically, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can always send me a message, Delane@DelaneMD.com. I'm happy to answer anything. If you want to set up a reverse your diabetes assessment call, there are specific things here that you struggle with, don't hesitate to reach out to me, Delane@DelaneMD.com. I'm happy to get you set up. You can also find it on my Calendly link, which is in my link tree on Instagram. It's in a lot of different places. So if you have access to that, go ahead and just set it up yourself. If not, send me a message and we'll get it set up. And I will see everybody next month. If you need anything between here and there, don't hesitate to reach out. I'll talk to you then. Thanks for showing up today. Bye.